Hello, this video will help you to understand the domestic threats that Elizabeth faced from the start of her reign. So as you can see, there are three units that you need to study as part of the Elizabeth unit. The first one is the domestic threats, which we're looking at today. There are also the foreign threats that she faced. And finally, we need to understand what it was like to live in Elizabethan England. So firstly, we need to know that domestic means home. So we're looking at the threats that Elizabeth faced in England from the time that she ascended to the throne, became queen, began her reign, 1558, to 1588, which is when Spain launched the Armada. And the best way to remember the threats that Elizabeth faced at the start of her reign in 1558 are through the mnemonic FIRE, F-I-R-E, which stands for the foreign threats, the issue of illegitimacy, the religious problems that she faced, and also the economic issues that she had to deal with. Firstly, Elizabeth faced severe foreign threats from the very beginning of her reign. Why? Well, if we look at the map, because she was surrounded by powerful Catholic countries. You can see in the south of Europe, you can see Spain, and Spain was hugely powerful, and in orange, and hugely powerful because it controlled the New World. And the leader of Spain, the Catholic King Philip II, was responsible for leading the Counter-Reformation. England was Protestant, of course, and Philip II was responsible, in his mind at least, for leading the Counter-Reformation, for turning countries such as England back from being Protestant into Catholic again. England was also surrounded to the north and to the south by enemies that had been enemies for quite some time and were also Catholic at the start of her reign. Those countries were Scotland and France, and Scotland and France were also part of the Old Alliance, AULD, and were, as enemies of England, there was a high likelihood that they might at some point join forces and invade. Secondly, Elizabeth faced problems because Catholics in particular saw her as illegitimate. They didn't see her as having been born in wedlock, and so they didn't think that she had the right to be queen. Henry VIII, her father, had married Catherine of Aragon and wanted to divorce her as she did not provide him with a son, but the Pope did not ratify or agree to the divorce, which meant that Catholics did not accept that Henry VIII had the right to marry Anne Boleyn, and Anne Boleyn was Elizabeth I's mother, and so they did not accept that Elizabeth I had the right to be queen, and they thought that someone else should take her role, and particularly from 1567 they thought it should be Mary Queen of Scots. Thirdly, she faced severe religious problems. Her country was divided between Catholics and Protestants. The previous monarch, Mary I, had been a Catholic, and so there was a serious risk of a sectarian war, which is a war over religion. The north of England was predominantly Catholic, and there was a strong likelihood that they might rebel against her, as we know they did later on in the reign. Finally, Elizabeth faced severe economic problems at the start of her reign, and these were mostly because her sister, Mary I, had left her with a huge debt of £300,000. Mary I had been involved in an unsuccessful war against France and had left the country with not only £300,000 in debt, but also £100,000 of that owed at a high compound interest rate of 14%, so the Antwerp Exchange, which meant that it would be very, very difficult for Elizabeth to repay, and also made it very difficult for Elizabeth to have a standing army or to afford a standing army. And a standing army is an army that you have on call when you need it. She wasn't able to get that. So, from the very start, huge problems, which explains why Elizabeth was keen on a religious settlement. A settlement is an agreement, and religious settlement is trying to sort out the religious problems in her country. Elizabeth, a Protestant of course, thought the best way to do this was to try to bring peace between the Protestants and Catholics. She wanted to find a middle way, a way of keeping both the majority of Catholics and Protestants on her side. So how did she do that? Well, firstly, she created the Act of Supremacy with the help of her Privy Council, and the Act of Supremacy meant that people in England were obliged to accept, or forced to accept, that Elizabeth was the supreme governor of the Church of England, and priests were required to sign or to swear an oath of allegiance to the Queen as the supreme governor, or else they would lose their job. And the vast majority did, with 8,000 of the 10,000 priests being prepared to accept that, which meant that the people in the churches were, for the most part, saying positive things about Elizabeth. Additionally, Elizabeth kept the peace with her religious settlement through creating the Act of Uniformity. Uniformity means everyone being forced to do the same thing. So how did she do this? Well, she created a book of common prayer, which could be interpreted, like this picture on the right, it could be interpreted in a number of different ways, so that both Catholics and Protestants were able to use the book to pray in ways that suited their different religions. So, if we were given a question like this in the exam, the religious settlement was an excellent solution to Elizabeth's problems, how far do you agree? We would need to agree and disagree and then add a conclusion. This is what you might want to do. If you wanted to write an agree paragraph, you could perhaps say that the majority of Catholics were prepared to support the religious settlement. You could then bring in evidence that thanks to the Book of Common Prayer, most Catholics felt that they could interpret the book of a prayer book in a way that they wanted and could therefore continue with their faith, and as a result they were prepared to support Elizabeth as the supreme governor if that it would allow them to quietly get on with their own worship. Secondly, she was able to keep the majority of priests on her side thanks to the Act of Supremacy. The priests who had no other source of income decided for the most part that they would agree to swear the oath of allegiance, and as a result 8 of the 10,000 stayed on board, which meant, as we've just heard, that she had people in the pulpits. The pulpits is the part of the church where people preach from. The priests in the pulpits were saying positive things about her. However, you'd also want to disagree, and you would disagree by talking about the recusant Catholics who were not prepared to see Elizabeth as the supreme governor, and you could mention how, as you know, from 1569 they actually openly revolted and plotted against her. You could also talk about the Puritans, who are extreme Protestants, so they are Protestants who were not prepared to accept the middle way because they thought that a church should not have crucifixes, a church should be simple and pure, and they also disliked the colourful vestments, colourful clothes that priests were expected to wear, because they thought that a priest should wear simple clothes so that the worshippers were not distracted from God. And if you were to then turn it into a conclusion, you could then talk about how it was successful initially because the majority of people were kept on board. However, because she wasn't able to keep the more extreme Catholics and Protestants on her side, they were later on going to cause her severe problems. Elizabeth's problems really became much more serious after the arrival of Mary, Queen of Scots in 1567. Mary, Queen of Scots was forced to flee from Scotland, which by then had become a Protestant country. She was accused of murdering her father, of her husband, and as a result, she had to leave. And when she did, she fled south to England in the hope that Elizabeth would be on her side. This was a huge issue for Elizabeth because Elizabeth was seen by many Catholics as illegitimate, whereas Mary, Queen of Scots, who was a distant relative of Henry VII, Henry VIII's father, she was considered to be the more legitimate monarch, and so Catholics began to turn to her at home. So Catholics, particularly recusant Catholics, felt that Mary would be a better queen. And additionally, Elizabeth began to face more problems abroad because King Philip II of Spain and other leaders that we're going to hear about in a minute felt that it would be far superior if England were to have Mary as their queen, a Catholic, which would mean that the country would experience a counter-reformation. This explains why there were, from 1569, revolts. So revolts are rebellions, and the first rebellion was the rebellion of the Northern Earls. This was a plot that was conjured up or came up with by the Duke of Norfolk with the support of Mary Queen of Scots, with a plan that they would marry. The Duke of Norfolk was a powerful Protestant noble who disliked Elizabeth because Elizabeth had given him the cold shoulder. So the plot that Elizabeth would be kicked out and Mary would marry the Duke of Norfolk. It didn't work out because the plot was uncovered and the Duke of Norfolk was imprisoned, but the revolt continued anyway. Two earls, and earls are also powerful nobles, two earls, the Earl of Westmoreland and the Earl of Northumberland, carried on with the rebellion, and they took over the cathedral at Durham, which is in the north of England, and they carried out Catholic prayers there. However, Elizabeth was able to successfully crush the rebellion, and she did that with the use of 14,000 soldiers who were provided for her by landowners and gentry in the north, including some Catholics. And as a result, Elizabeth wanted to send a clear message to other recusant Catholics not to try to revolt, and so she executed 450 people. So how do we remember the plots against Elizabeth? Because these plots were a real threat and they are quite tricky to remember. We use a fork as the way to remember. And this is also a way that you could answer a question that came up on the revolt of the Northern Earls too. You would write 3 paragraphs. The first one would be they were a threat because there was an alternative monarch. That's the A for the A fork. There was an alternative monarch. Secondly, there was a problem or a threat because of foreign threats, because foreign countries such as Spain and important nobles in France were prepared to support these plots. And thirdly, they were a problem because recusant Catholics were prepared to rebel for all sorts of reasons we'll look at now. Now, the first of the plots was in 1571. So, as you can see across the top, a fork, because there are 3 paragraphs that you could write if you're asked why the Ridolfi plot was a threat. The first one would be the alternative monarch. Mary Queen of Scots arrived in 1567 and was seen by many recusant Catholics as a more legitimate monarch. As a result, they would prefer her to be queen and were prepared to revolt or to plot in order to try to achieve that. Secondly, you've got FO, which is for foreign threats. There was a significant foreign threat because Philip II of Spain was prepared to support the Ridolfi plot and to provide 10,000 troops, or at least that's what he promised to do. And thirdly, the recusant Catholics were keen to overthrow Elizabeth, partly because Elizabeth was quite brutal in 1569 when she executed 450 Catholics for the revolt of the Northern Earls, but also because in 1570 the Pope issued a papal bull, which is a letter which was sent to Catholics in England telling them that Mary was the more legitimate monarch and that they should overthrow Elizabeth as she was not a legitimate queen. Elizabeth was able to tackle that plot, but more followed. So 12 years later, Elizabeth faced the Throckmorton plot, 1583. Again, the same A, because there's still Mary Queen of Scots around, and she is still seen as an alternative monarch. This time, slightly different foreign threats. Philip II is still there, but also the Duke of Guise, who is a powerful Catholic noble in France who was prepared to support the revolt, or at least said that he would. And thirdly, recusant Catholics who were angry because the Queen had created a new law which made it an act of treason if you were to try to convert anyone to becoming a Catholic. Treason was punishable by death, which meant the recusant Catholics faced death for simply trying to tell someone about their faith. The final plot, the Babington plot, was a major problem, again, because of Mary, Queen of Scots. It was also an issue because of the huge number of soldiers that the Duke of Guise promised to provide. He said that he would provide 60,000 soldiers, which would have been enough to overcome any army that Elizabeth would have been able to create. And finally, recusant Catholics were again angered, with many having been imprisoned after the previous Throckmorton plot, and 11,000 in jail, which meant the recusant Catholics felt that they had no choice now but to plot against Elizabeth because she was being so harsh in her treatment of them. As we know, the Babington plot failed, and it also, very importantly, led to the beheading of Mary, Queen of Scots in 1587, which meant that, at least domestically, Elizabeth's problems were over. Now, finally, what would you do if you were given a question like this one? The plots against Elizabeth were a particular threat because of their foreign support. How far do you agree? And again, you're thinking about the mnemonic and you're thinking about how you could use that to agree and disagree. And if you do that, this question is, I hope, reasonably straightforward. So agree would just be talking about foreign support. And we know, as we just heard it, that there was considerable foreign support. You could talk about the Duke of Guise, the number of soldiers he promised. You could talk about Philip II. You could also, of course, talk about the papal bull, so that the Pope was prepared to support the revolts as well. And then on the other side, you could talk about the other reasons why the plots were such a threat. And the most important of those, perhaps, is that there was an alternative monarch, which meant that if Elizabeth was overthrown, someone else, a Catholic, Mary Queen of Scots, could take her place. And secondly, you could talk about the recusant Catholics and why they were a danger, because there was a serious risk that they would cause a sectarian war because they wanted to overthrow Elizabeth. And then you could add details about recusant Catholic anger at the actions that she took, such as imprisoning 11,000, and how this inspired further revolts to be created by the Catholics. That's it.